Lest we forget, 100 years after the armistice, the First World War has been commemorated on every sort of artistic platform, including film, illustration and music. With a century separating us from the end of hostilities on the Western Front, first-hand accounts have all but disappeared. But meticulously researched factual filmmaking is helping us put together the missing pieces of history. Director Peter Jackson has delved into the archives for his latest film, They Shall Not Grow Old. He's made use of cutting-edge technology to bring footage and photography to life in colour, allowing us to see the First World War from the point of view of those who are in the trenches. Let's hear more from Peter Jackson on the creative process.
The film became very emotional because the one thing that happens when you do ultimately restore it, the faces of the men just suddenly come to life. And that's the one thing that amazed me, is suddenly I'm looking at these human beings. This is not about Passchendaele or the Somme or the tactics, or, you know, it's not the First World War story in that regard. It's a film about the people that were in the war.
Yeah, good luck, lads. Here it's dead. Well done.
Well, in addition to that global account of the conflict, French director François Reinhardt's been shining a light on a lesser-known story, the role of the so-called Harlem Hellfighters, the African-American men who gave their lives to the war effort in Europe. Now, the film's being shown as part of the Étoile Documentary Festival at the Forum des Images here in Paris. Let's get an idea of what it's about.
Today we present America's highest military decoration, the Medal of Honor, to Private Henry Johnson, who served in World War I nearly a century ago. We can't change what happened to too many soldiers like him, who went uncelebrated because our nation judged them by the color of their skin and not the content of their character. But we can do our best to make it right.
Joining us now is Director of the Paris Veterans and War Victims Office, André Rakoto. André, thanks for joining us. You participated in that documentary as well. Now, the story of the 369th Infantry Regiment, also called the Harlem Hellfighters, is not a particularly well-known one. Why do you think that is?
World War I, to start with, is not a very well-known war, I think, for most of the public. So the story of the 369th Infantry, the Harlem Hellfighters, was another smaller event in a war that was not very famous. And we thought it'd be interesting to focus on it at the time of the centennial, because there is a complex history behind their coming to France, and it was worth working on them and imparting a remembrance of their history.
Now, I know that when some of these men went to fight as part of the French army, music was involved as well. They brought a certain kind of music with them. Some of them were accomplished musicians themselves. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yes. Every regiment had a band. And of course, a prize for the regiment was to be able to enlist James Swiss Europe, who was a very famous musician in New York, where he changed the way black musicians performed. With his band, he was able to bridge the communities, in the sense that he would perform a lot for white audiences. He changed the way black musicians would present themselves and how they would work professionally with music, and he achieved a very interesting fame before the war. So it was important for the regiment to be able to have him and to make a band under his direction. And in fact, he was not so keen to start with, and he asked for, he said, if I want to make a very nice band, it's going to cost at least $10,000, which was a big sum at the time. And Colonel Edward, who was the regimental commander, managed to get the money. And James Swiss Europe was able then to go and hire musicians as far as Puerto Rico.
Yeah, and that music, ragtime and jazz, was very well received by the French people
Absolutely.
listening to it, I
Yes.
think. Now, many of these men believe that fighting under the American flag, in American uniforms, alongside their French peers, would help improve their situation, their civil rights, when they returned to the States. Did things improve? How did it change things for the black community?
There's a before and after. Not everyone was convinced that, not every black citizen in the US was convinced that going to war would change anything, because there had been examples in the past. Every war fought by the US, including the Civil War, had involved black soldiers. And each time they thought it would bring them a better consideration, and each time it failed. So I read the testimony of a black worker from New York who said to a journalist, well, you know what? The Germans have done nothing to me, and if they have, I forgive them. But on the other hand, many other black leaders, like W.E.B. Du Bois, for instance, were convinced that this was a major conflict and that the black man should be there because it would be the one this time that would help them get their equal citizenship in the US. Unfortunately, the end of the war brought a period called the Red Summer, during which there were about 77 lynchings, if I remember well, and a lot of incidents involving soldiers, veterans wearing their uniforms, black veterans. The American white society was not ready to welcome black soldiers. And it was not at that time that the progress expected happened. It changed the perception of blacks in society in a way, and it prepared for the changes that would occur one war later with World War II, because it's actually World War II that brought the end of segregation right after the war, after an experiment during the Battle of the Bulge, during which units were desegregated. The executive order signed by President Truman came right after that, and the first conflict during which soldiers were in mixed units was the Korean War. So World War I started something. It was not achieved then, but it did start something very much.
Indeed, looking forward to the civil rights movement which came afterwards. And André Rakoto, thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Today. Now, that documentary, The Grande Guerre des Harlem Hellfighters, is being screened at the Étoile Documentary Festival, which runs until November 11th. Next, we're taking a look at some visual accounts of the war that rely less on grainy footage and more on pen and ink. A collective of graphic novelists from all over the world have put their artistic renditions together in a new anthology in French that's also been adapted into English. Yenna Lee and Mary Schuster tell us more.
Diving into illustrated stories about World War I, a war that's now too long ago for most of us to remember. To revive our collective memory, more than 40 writers and illustrators have come together from across the world to release traces of the Great War. 18 short stories that showcase the lasting legacy of a conflict that ended 100 years ago.
What are we trying to pass on? That's probably the question that came up more than we expected, because we have the inevitable things such as monuments and cemeteries. Then we have all that we've absorbed growing up, and what's left in our collective memory.
Authors reached deep into their personal histories to talk about how this international event affected them. German-Japanese manga artist Mikiko chose to write about when her own grandmother described the war as a monster.
I'm just bringing my own unique perspective because I have grown up mixed, and it's just a little flavor really, but I was trying to emphasize my German side this time. Despite the Germans having a Second World War that really overshadows the first, I tried to dig deeper and find something that was personal and tell that story.
World War I had far-reaching consequences. Even those miles away from the front line have memories to share. Ivorian writer Marguerite Aboué once heard about the story of a grandmother named Lucy. Identifying herself through her story, she chose to write in Lucy's voice.
I'm trying to talk about the little wars that made the Great War, because unfortunately we don't talk much about them. The Lucy character, she is me and you. Most of all, she's France. The history of France is, after all, quite international, because there is a Lucie in every continent.
Bringing together a wide variety of cultural and geographical perspectives. This international collaboration prompts readers to reflect on the impact and legacy of the Great War.
We're finishing with a musical tribute now, and it's not a genre you might associate with the beginning of the 20th century. French rapper MC Solar evokes the First World War on his latest album, Géopoétique. Known for exploring some of the founding myths of contemporary French society, the musician tells the story of a whole village which fell victim to the war. That track's called Les Mirabelles, and we'll leave you with a clip. Do remember you can watch our past shows and keep up with news from the world of arts and culture on our website. Stay with us here on France 24. There's more news coming up in just a moment.
La joie, des pleurs, des fleurs, la peur tout à l'heure. On a fusillé un déserteur. Il avait ce poème dans sa vareuse. Adieu, meuse endormeuse. On ne me croit pas, ça semble irréel. Avant tout ce manège, j'étais un village enchanté. Les seuls témoins sont les Mirabelles. Avant tout ce manège.
In 2003, US armed forces invaded Iraq, setting in motion 15 years of violence. Once Saddam Hussein was ousted, the country unraveled into chaos. Iraq became breeding grounds for terrorism. The so-called Islamic State declared its caliphate there. Several years later, the Iraqi government was finally able to proclaim victory against the Islamic State organization. Rampant corruption, political divisions, and a lack of respect for women's rights, amongst a slew of other issues, continue to cripple life in Baghdad. However, bombings are now a rare occurrence. Sidewalk cafes, book markets and art galleries are reopening, bringing a glimmer of hope to the Iraqi capital.
A wind of hope blows through Baghdad in Iraq. That's this week's Revisited here on France 24.